Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Camelia Shofani, and I'm the Senior Manager of Public Programs and Events at the International Documentary Association. I want to thank you for joining us for a conversation around the documentary The Princess, moderated by Variety's Jenelle Riley. This panel discussion includes the director Ed Perkins and producer Simon Chinn. I'd also like to thank our ASL interpreters, Selena and Avery, and cart provider, Cindy, for joining us at the last minute. Before we get started, I also wanted to offer a brief land acknowledgement. We recognize the Gabrielino Tongva as the past, present, and future caretakers of the land, water, and cultural resources in the unceded territory of Los Angeles. So now, I'll pass it on to Jenelle, but for any more information on the screening series lineup, you can visit our website at documentary.org/screening/series. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about this fascinating movie with producer Simon Chinn and director Ed Perkins. Before we really get started, though, it literally within the last couple hours we had received word about Queen Elizabeth II's passing. Where are sort of your heads at right now, having spent so much time, studying this family and as British citizens yourselves?
Well, it's a very momentous and I think sad day, and I think I've been quite taken aback by quite how strongly I feel in the last few hours. Actually, the starting point for making the Diana film, our film The Princess, was a kind of very, very vivid memory I had of my emotional reaction to Diana's death back 25 years ago when I was 11, and this very strong memory of being woken up and my parents kind of rushing into my room and being very, very emotional and telling me that Diana had died, and then sitting with the rest of my family around a little TV and for the hours and then days after her death, kind of watching this extraordinary footage of tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets of London and gather outside Buckingham Palace, very much like we're seeing footage of today. And I remember back then when I was 11, there was this sort of extraordinary, unprecedented outpouring of collective grief. There were grown men and women crying on the streets, and I remember as an 11-year-old feeling confused, like pretty confused as to what was happening. I probably wasn't old enough to feel like emotionally invested in the story enough to feel sad or to cry, but I remember trying to work out what was happening. And one of the things that was happening and that people were saying on the streets of London was that they were surprised at how they were feeling, that they didn't realize how much Diana or the monarchy meant to them until she died. And yeah, I think I feel a little bit of that today. It does feel like an enormous moment and a real seismic shift, and I think I think we'll see in the coming days many of the same pictures that we saw 25 years ago. I think it's going to have a massive impact on millions of people in this country and around the world.
Simon?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously is a huge sort of era-defining day, and I guess probably one of those days that we'll all look back on and sort of remember vividly, remember where we were, remember how we felt. I mean, yeah, and obviously Ed and I are kind of looking at it through the prism of having just made this film. Obviously, we made the film with no awareness that the Queen was going to die around its release. We obviously were aware that the Queen was going to die at some point soon and that things would shift. The mantle would be passed, and that is indeed what's happening now. And I guess just in the past couple of hours, I've also been watching the news, the BBC and, the coverage. And I was also struck by some of the same sort of imagery, but, the flag flying at half-mast, flag of Buckingham Palace, which it eventually did. I say eventually, quite pointedly after Diana's death, because of course the Queen broke protocol in the face of huge public demand to fly the flag at half-mast for Diana. But the flag is flying at half-mast today in to conform with royal tradition and protocol. And I guess as I'm watching the news, I'm kind of thinking that how much protocol and tradition is involved in this moment. The Queen passes seamlessly. Prince Charles acceds to the throne as King Charles III. This is predestined. He's been waiting for this all his life. He is now the oldest monarch to take the throne ever, to fulfill his destiny. And, you know, I'm sort of kind of sitting here being reminded actually of the kind of inherent, I guess, tradition and stability that the British monarchy in these moments sort of represents, you know, and you kind of compare it with the sort of precariousness of the moment in the aftermath of Diana's death, you know, which felt, you know, and people at the time spoke about that, or not long after it spoke about that as a Republican moment, a moment of great peril for the monarchy, which actually the Queen, you know, rest in peace, sort of ultimately handled as she has handled everything. She figured it out, you know, she understood what she needed to do finally to sort of adapt herself to those particular circumstances and challenges. And that's why she, I believe, will be remembered as a very great statesperson.
You know, the other thing I reflect on is already on the TV, people are talking about the way in which they felt like they had a sort of personal connection to the Queen. And I think there's an interesting parallel there. Obviously, Diana and the Queen were very different characters, and the relationships they had with people were very different. But there was something about perhaps both of them that created what felt like very personal relationships with millions and millions of people who had perhaps only ever seen them from afar, or perhaps only knew them through the archive, through the news. And yet she sort of became, the Queen has become part of our lives, has kind of created this foundation, you know, for so many people's lives, and has been a kind of a rock, a kind of a glue for many people, not for everyone, but for lots of people, and a sort of a foundation for a sense of national identity in some ways. So yeah,
I actually saw the news. Tony Blair is quoted as saying in tribute to her that she was the matriarch of the nation. And it is that kind of feeling you have. She was like this incredibly solid, you know, the parent that you hope for, right? The parent who can sort of keep everything calm, even though she herself might be struggling, you know, in turmoil, dealing with a lot of difficult challenges within her family and beyond. She never presented as such. She always managed to project calm, you know. And it'll be really kind of fascinating to see how Charles sort of steps into those shoes, you know. And I guess, you know, it's interesting, particularly in view of our film and the story it tells, right? It tells a story about a dark chapter in the monarchy, right? Where Charles himself was revealed to be very human, you know, and arguably exposed in lots of ways to the public through the media. And that's something that actually somehow the Queen always managed to avoid, or you know, she always sort of seemed to have this sort of innate understanding about not giving too much away, being sort of poker faced, this kind of idea that if you let too much light in, you'll destroy the mystery, that the mystery is the thing that, one of the things that the monarchy needs to kind of preserve itself, you know. but of course, it's incredibly difficult in the age of modern media and social media.
It's so interesting for me because I rewatched The Princess last night to prepare for this. And you do see those images of people around Buckingham Palace, and to see them on screens today, it does show you, how much this family or this monarchy means to people.
Yeah.
And I'm just sort of curious, why are we, even those of us who live in America, why are we so fascinated with this institution or with this family for so many years?
Well, I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I mean, in a sense, our film is one big attempt to try to get to the bottom of that. I mean, I do think there is something fascinating about the way in which we're not just fascinated by the institution of monarchy and this royal family, but especially in times like this, when a member of the royal family dies, it almost feels to a lot of people like a member of their own family has passed, and even on the news now, you're hearing people talk about it in that way. And again, I think there is an interesting parallel there between the way people were talking in the aftermath of Diana's death, where, I've been saying this a lot in the last few weeks doing interviews, that it felt to me when I was an 11-year-old looking at people grieving, that they were grieving as though they'd lost a family member, as though they'd lost a mother or a daughter or a sister. Part of our film also is I think a critique of the way that we, the people, the public, turn the stories of people in public life generally, but in this case specifically the royal family, kind of into a form of entertainment or a sort of national soap opera, a national sitcom. And I think one of the really interesting things for me coming out of this process is, at its best, documentary it's an exercise in empathy. And when you spend 2 years of your life making a film about anyone, whether they're royal or not, I guess you're invited to try to put yourself in their shoes and try to understand their life and how they've lived their life and the decisions they might have made. And I come out the other end of this actually feeling much more sympathetic towards the sort of the people at the heart of this story, because I see them not as characters in a national soap opera, but as human beings, fallible and flawed like all of us, but human beings who I think on the whole are really trying to do the best in a very difficult position, often a very difficult position, and a position that they're born into, that they have no choice but to accept if they so want to. I think it's complicated, isn't it?
I think one of the reasons why there is this sort of enduring fascination with the monarchy is sort of, and I hope don't want this to come across as too simplistic, but it's because of its weirdness. It is an institution that's just out of time. For a long time it wasn't, but it really now is, and it's so archaic, and it's driven by these sort of very, very archaic traditions and rituals and protocols. And as Ed says, within it, there are real people, right? That we have come to understand as being real and fallible, just like us, through the media. And Diana was, in a way, the absolute sort of essence of that. She was a woman who kind of came from noble birth, but wasn't part of the institution of the monarchy, was close to it, but had sort of evolved into this sort of kind of modern secular woman, and had kind of married into the monarchy, and exposed its fault lines and its problems, but because she didn't fit, as no modern person can really, that isn't born into that institution. And that is, I think, the source of our fascination. It's just that collision of worlds, I guess, or sort of this sort of disconnect between the world that we live in and that, and that kind of that becomes combustible. And we just see that much more now, and we saw it with with Meghan in much the same way.
But isn't it also precisely what you're talking about there that is one of the reasons so many people so value the royal family, right? Which is that if you think of the enormous change, socio-political or cultural change that's happened in the last 70 years of Elizabeth's reign, so much has changed. The world is almost non-recognizable, and yet the monarchy provides that kind of constant, right? That sort of that foundation to things that I think, I can't speak for anyone else, but I think is important for people, for millions of people.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Around the world, right? There's a sort of strange paradox there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no great monarchist, but as I said, the thing that I was reminded of tonight, looking at the images and hearing the news of the accession, as I said, was just how seamless and how predetermined it is, and how, that becomes a sort of political entity. We have an unelected head of state, and that feels wrong in the modern age, and yet it is also the source of great stability that perhaps arguably you don't have in America in the same way at all. So it is a complicated picture, and I'm definitely not an out-and-out Republican because it's complicated. I think there is something to be said for the sort of stability and continuity that the monarchy represents as an institution. But the big question everyone's asking is how it adapts to the modern world, and can it?
That's why I'm really curious when you started working on this film, and where was the monarchy at then? Because I know some people will see this and maybe think it's some sort of a companion piece or a response to Harry and Meghan, stepping back from the royal family. But Ed, I believe you've been wanting to make this movie for like 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, I have. I mean, I think Simon and I first talked about this story about 5 years ago, and I think it took us a couple of years of talking between the two of us to work out what new perspective we could bring to this. I mean, the truth is that the Diana story is one of the most told and retold stories probably in the last 20 or 30 years. And, these films take a couple of years to make. And we felt strongly that it was only worthwhile taking on a story like this that people have very strong opinions of and who have watched many documentaries about, if we had something new to offer to the conversation. I mean, I guess at some deep level, I felt that a lot of the documentaries that have been made about her, and perhaps will continue to be made about her, have the sort of explicit aim of trying to get inside her head, inside Diana's head. They're kind of interior, and they, I think, are trying to understand how she feels, to understand her psyche, for want of a better word, and to understand perhaps what's motivating certain decisions in her life. And, I think that is really interesting. People have been fascinated by trying to understand Diana's feelings and thoughts, but it does, I guess, I've always felt it does inevitably involve speculation. And I guess I've just always felt with the Diana story in particular that the part of the story that was more interesting for me and had been less explored was not what does this story say about Diana, but actually, or rather, what does Diana's story say about all of us? And so I guess what Simon and I, after a few years, started to feel like was interesting is like, what can Diana's story, in what way can Diana's story hold a mirror up to us? In what way can it force us to ask ourselves some difficult questions about, yes, our relationship to Diana, but more broadly, our relationship to monarchy, which obviously, we're talking about for obvious reasons today, and we'll continue to talk about. But I think even more broadly than that, what can it say about our relationship to celebrity culture and this complex relationship between us, the public, and people in public life as mediated by the press? And then I guess there's a sort of central question which I've always been fascinated about, which is, what was our role in this story? Because I've always felt like when this isn't a story, the Diana story, and I think ongoing, the monarchy, the story of monarchy is not something that we just sit back and passively watch. It feels like a story that we're somehow kind of active participants in, right? And I was interested in trying to make a film that explored our, for want of a better word, our complicity.
Is that why, did you decide? Go ahead.
Sorry, no. And I was just gonna. I was sorry. I was just gonna talk about.
No, please.
The sort of the formal approach of the film and sort of taking this sort of exclusively archival approach with sort of no other original elements than, I guess, a score and our kind of collective, the editing process, I guess, the craft of telling the story and how we were going to tell it was absolutely kind of, I think, fundamental to our sort of embracing it as a story. But we actually made a film called LA 92 some years ago, which came out to coincide with the 25th anniversary of the LA riots, and it was a very similar approach, albeit I think a very different film. But it was very, very illuminating as a sort of an experience of making a documentary. Partly because you sort of go in not quite knowing what the filmmaking language you're going to emerge with is going to be. It's something that's going to evolve quite organically, but the kind of ambition, I guess, is to sort of immerse audiences in the material and to tell the story as if it were happening in the present. And there are certain rules, which is that there are no retrospective voices, there's no hindsight analysis. You can't contextualize things perhaps as you might otherwise in a documentary, because you're only revealing things as they happened contemporaneously. And there's a certain discipline and there's certain kind of limitations to this form. But I would say what it offers as a sort of viewing experience is the opportunity for the audience to sort of experience the story in a less mediated fashion than otherwise possible in the usual, with the usual documentary conventions, and sort of bring their hindsight knowledge, prejudices, biases, feelings, emotions to the story in a completely different way. It's not us sort of telling you how to feel, ideally. It's you responding to a very immersive and sort of visceral telling of the story. And I think we felt quite confident about that would lead to something powerful, interesting, and above all, different in terms of how audiences could relate to a story that they'd heard or seen so many times before.
The big learning I also had from LA 92 was that it took, well, first of all, it kind of washed over me. It kind of acts like a time machine, and hopefully our film does the same. It kind of picks you up and drops you back into that time, and you're not allowed to escape. There's no present tense headshot interview to allow you to escape from the story. You're just forced to live there. And I found that to be a really visceral, but also kind of like highly emotional experience. Like I felt it as much as I think it. And I think sometimes when we're making docs, we're trying to obviously make intelligent films for the head. But with this film, we were trying to make a film kind of for the heart, as cliched as it is, because people's relationship to Diana, and I think to the royal family, I don't think is necessarily an intellectual one. It's an emotional one. They felt this relationship with Diana. I didn't understand why they felt it. That's part of the reason for making the film, is for me to try to understand on a personal level why they felt it. But we wanted to invite audiences to go back on that emotional journey. And the other fascinating thing about this story is that there's been so much analysis. Like, we've watched The Crown and we've watched Spencer and we've read the books, and we've all just consumed over the last 25 years this analysis of Diana, and we all come at this story with, I guess, emotional baggage, for want of a better word. Like, we all bring our own preconceived ideas, and we thought it'd be exciting and an interesting creative challenge to not pretend that we could come at this afresh, but actually as Simon says, give audiences the space in the film to come to their own conclusions, to bring their own hindsight to bear, to re-experience the story. But because we're giving them space, because we're not having interviewees telling you what's happening or telling you how to feel, we're also hoping that people can reframe the story for themselves and hopefully see it afresh.
And there's also a sort of mythology that's sort of, sort of grown around Diana, particularly through some of these sort of, I don't want to describe them as fictional, but semi-fictional tellings of the story, the scripted sort of adaptations of the story, and also some of the documentaries. I mean, it's very one of the, I guess, the discoveries for us in just looking at the archive. It was a discovery. It was a sort of reminder, actually, because we lived through it. Was what a divisive figure Diana was, which is often airbrushed out of a lot. She's often presented as a sort of a saintly figure, about whom there was nothing but, huge public sympathy. Well, that was actually couldn't be further from the truth. Before she died, she was hugely divisive, and I think our film is quite honest about that. And it's particularly interesting when you look at the divisiveness of Diana in relation to, Meghan's experience of being in the monarchy, and how divisive she was and still is, So it's sort of, it feels very resonant to what's going on at the moment. But there were other sort of discoveries that we made. I mean, sort of certainly this kind of like trying to sort of unlock this sort of national dialogue around the monarchy that sort of took place over the kind of best part of 2 decades. Really that sort of became, a thing that we became, I think, increasingly interested in, and how we can sort of reflect that dialogue and this sort of evolution from kind of public reverence to the monarchy that you kind of find around the marriage of Charles and Diana, which was this sort of fairy tale marriage where all the kind of warning signs as to their unsuitability as a couple were sort of completely ignored by the media and the public, to this kind of creeping realization of how unsuitable they were, and this sort of national obsession about their marriage and then Diana, leading to great irreverence towards the institution, the monarchy, particularly around her death. I mean, that sort of kind of narrative and that shift is something that we became quite excited about, sort of reflecting over the kind of 100 minutes of our film.
I mean, obviously, there's so much out there about Diana. I'm curious where you even began. I mean, how much footage did you have? Did you put out a call for footage? And then how do you decide what to use?
Well, I gave a slightly naive direction at the beginning of the film to our archive team to basically just find everything that existed on Diana, because I think because there have been so many films about Diana and they tend all to use the same sort of pool of archive, I felt it was really important to try to find new or less seen archive. And I also wanted to be guided by the archive. I was hoping that we would find within the archive the truth of the story, but also a new perspective from which to tell the story. And I think, given that this film has been told many times before and lots of archive teams have scoured the planet trying to find never before seen archive, I think the challenge, we were always realistic about the fact we probably were never going to unearth some secret treasure trove. But I do think we've made some really interesting discoveries. And I think, the fact was that for 25, for 16, 17 years of her adult life, when she was on the most public of stages, she probably was the most filmed or photographed person on the planet. And so, very quickly our edit was filled with hundreds, I think close to 1,000 hours of footage, something like that. And the kind of first job of the filmmaking process was just watching. Like, I think I spent the first 6 months of the edit but even before our editors started, just like watching archive 8, 10, 12 hours a day, and just like unedited rushes and trying to find within it little moments that, interested me or moved me or confused me. And I would mark them up and create these enormous sort of pools, these select reels that I then gave to our incredible editors, Jinx Godfrey and Dan Lapira, who then kind of sort of wove this tapestry of a film together. But the things that I found myself most drawn to in the footage were often operating on the level of kind of subtext or body language. You know, the truth is that this isn't a revelatory film. We know the story, you know, we know the twists and turns of this archetypal story. What we're trying to offer is a new perspective. And so what I found myself really drawn to often with Diana was like her body language. And I came to see her as almost like talked about this before, but like almost like a silent movie star, you know, from the old black and white Hollywood movies, someone who didn't speak that much publicly in her adult life, and yet somehow seemed able to project her own private story publicly and sort of seemed to invite us all into her inner world, or at least allowed us to project onto her what we thought was happening. And that seemed interesting because there were moments in the archive where I would look at it and think, I think she's trying to say this, or, you know, I think it's about this. And I would take it to our editors who would say, no, I think totally the opposite. And that felt interesting, that different people were coming away from the same bit of footage with very different ideas of what was happening. And we sort of wanted to embrace that in a sense, because my feeling was that that's what we were all doing all the time. We were all constantly projecting onto her and onto her marriage and onto this story for 16, 17 years. You know, we spent all of that time dissecting everything she did and everywhere she went and everything she said. And the film in totality is a sort of critique, or at least a warning of the dangers of the excess of that kind of constant speculation and projection. But that was the way we sort of approached it. And we slowly whittled this 1,000-hour mountain of archive down and down and down. It took a long time though. I mean, Simon, you probably had the same on LA 92. I can't remember what the edit was on that, but it takes a long time. It took a long time on this film to make it feel coherent and to make it feel as though we weren't just telling a story that we already knew.
And knowing that you can't include everything, just because, you know, you have to be particular and some things maybe don't lend themselves to the story. But was there anything you found that really surprised you, that for whatever reason, you know, you couldn't fit it into the movie?
Oh, no, I think most of the big discoveries that we made, we did get into the movie. I mean, the two most interesting bits of footage that I think, for me at least, that we found are, they sort of bookend the film. One of them is that opening sequence, which is filmed by an Australian tourist who happened to be in Paris the night that Diana tragically died. And she's with a group of friends and they're kind of driving around the streets of Paris, and they come across the Ritz, and there's a gathering outside the Ritz, which we all now obviously know is a gathering of tourists and also paparazzi and photographers who knew that Diana was inside and were waiting for her to come outside. And what's sort of eerie and unsettling about that footage is that, of course, they didn't know what was about to happen, and so they're outside the Ritz and they're singing and dancing and happy, and there's a mood of real excitement and anticipation. And then at the end of that sequence, you see the cars and the motorbikes kind of speed off into the night, and that felt unnerving and also interesting for us, because it does exactly what we were hoping to do, which is we're not trying to give the viewer any privileged position. We're not trying to make the claim that we can take the viewer behind the palace walls or into Diana's head. We're trying, in a sense, to put you back in the position where you were at the time. And the other, I think, very powerful bit of footage is a group of, I think, American or Canadian men who, again, it's on the night that Diana died, but they're playing cards, they're playing Uno. And in the background on the TV, there's this kind of rolling footage from that night. And you see, over the course of the night, the news goes from being slightly optimistic that Diana had perhaps been hurt, but not too badly, to obviously at the end of the night, there's this tragic realization that she's died. And you see over the course of the evening, these men, these real people in real time kind of react to this. And they're kind of dismissive at the beginning of what's happening, which probably reflects a lot of the way that people felt at the time, which is things like this don't happen to people like that. You know, this wasn't the way that the fairy tale was supposed to end. And then when the news finally comes through, you just kind of, you feel this kind of shock, you see it on their faces. And I suspect a lot of people will respond to that and and it might invite them back to think about where they were when they first heard the news. But yeah, they sort of somehow,
and it's also this response that sort of reflects this idea that they were kind of genuinely grieving for her, as if she was a member of their family, as if she was someone that they knew very well. And I think a lot of people had the similar sort of reaction. And it does raise so many fascinating questions about what that was. What is that kind of emotional response? Is it born of some kind of obsession? Is it the same response that we have to, other celebrities that we obsess about? So I think it's a fascinating moment.
It was, I'm so glad you addressed that, because I am not kidding. I was playing Uno with friends and so like, it was so surreal when that scene came on. And I was actually really curious, like, how you got that footage. Did you was it just something that was put in archive somewhere?
Well, it was an archive. It was a archive researcher on our team it was her first day on the job, and our archive team had, they've been scouring all these, dark and dusty archive warehouses all over the world for footage. And this amazing researcher came on and just started searching YouTube, and this clip turned up on YouTube. And I guess it had been there for a long time and had been seen by a few people, but I don't know, it seemed, I found it really moving, and it seemed to kind of encapsulate exactly what we were trying to do in the film. And there's something really interesting about that moment, but I think also about broadly Diana's life, which is there's something about her life and her public story that somehow kind of like intertwined with so many people's lives. And going back and reliving her life seems to give people permission to go back into their own life. Like it somehow gives people permission to go back into their own nostalgic pasts and re-experience those moments. And so many people, when we've had screenings of this film, have come up to me afterwards saying things like, I just didn't think I was going to be so emotional. Like I didn't, I know what happens. I was sad at the time, but it was 25 years ago, but there was something about that moment that took me back. Even like the wedding, someone came up to me the other day and said, the wedding just got me. And it wasn't that I was watching Charles and Diana get married. It was that I remember exactly where I was, and I remember how I felt, and I remember I was on holiday with my parents, and we were in a caravan, and like it was like a hardwire back to a specific powerful moment in their life. And that, there's just something about, perhaps uniquely about Diana, that I think sort of created these bridges with lots of people in their own lives.
It was so surreal. I was like, wait a second, when I saw that moment, because I remember vividly playing Uno when the TV was on and having the same reaction, like, oh, she'll be fine. And it was literally like someone had put a camera in our room.
And it's also one of those moments, like I can think, in my whole life, I can think of a handful of moments where it really just felt like just time just stopped, like the entire world was suddenly like focused on this one singular event. And I guess for me it was 9/11. The other one was Diana's death, and probably the events of today will for lots of people be a similar thing, where it just feels like the normal grind of life just suddenly stops, and this kind of like really seismic event happens that needs to be looked at and thought about, whatever your views on the institution of monarchy or whatever. So yeah, for me
it was a very different kind of event when Diana died, because
totally different.
What followed the sort of collective feeling of shock and sadness was something very complicated. That's very difficult to sort of even articulate. And we discussed at great length as a team how we were going to handle the sort of week after her death, because we all remembered it quite differently. We were all different ages, quite apart from anything else. And I certainly remember it as a sort of, I think I was a 27-year-old young TV producer, wasn't actually working at the time. So I sort of ended up sort of curiously kind of traveling through London, Kensington Palace and whatnot, sort of observing what was going on and feeling weirdly, increasingly alienated from the kind of the public mood. I was like, as were many of my peers. I was like, there was a point at which we just like, we don't recognize our country anymore. This is really strange. But we didn't have social media at the time, so we didn't realize that probably most young people in the country may well have felt quite similar to the way we did, which was certainly I think the kind of the reaction on Twitter to the Platinum Jubilee it was a very vocal shrug, I think. Vocal, not vocal, but you know what I mean. So yeah, I just think, so we wanted to kind of reflect the craziness of the aftermath of her death as much as we wanted to reflect the sadness and tragedy, so it was interesting.
Well, again, I want to remind everyone watching this that the movie is currently streaming on HBO Max, so you can watch it again. I want to thank you so much for being here today. And again, congratulations on a really fascinating film.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the time.